Well, we're in Ruth 4, finishing our time looking at this Old Testament book of Ruth, as we've looked at it over the last few weeks. And the final episode this evening. I have a friend of mine who gets sort of drawn in and slightly stressed by cliffhangers at the end of TV episodes. Either if she watches them late at night, she can't get to sleep, or she sort of can't resist watching the next episode to find out what happened. And so in order to stop her from sort of binging on TV programs, she watches episodes, but sort of halfway through one to halfway through another, so that the cliffhanger is never right at the end, so that she can avoid binging. It's not a tactic that I have particularly taken, but it's one that she does. Now, last week we saw chapter 3 sort of ending on a bit of a cliffhanger. It was going so well. Ruth and Boaz looked like it was going to work out for them, but then it turns out that there's another man in the picture. He wanted to marry Ruth. He wanted to be with her, but we saw just before the sort of credits roll at the end of chapter 3, there was another fella in the picture, as it were. We can see that in verse where is it now? Right at the end, sort of 10 to 13, he says, I will marry you, although, verse 12, it is true that I'm a guardian redeemer, there is another who is more closely related than I am. So Boaz wants to marry Ruth, but the cliffhanger is there's somebody else in the picture, and that's where we saw it end last time. But now, as we look into chapter 4, we're going to see three things this evening. The first is a problem for Boaz. A problem for Boaz. Now, the problem for Boaz is that he has competition. He is no longer the main person in the pecking order. In fact, in the legal pecking order, he's now number 2. And that's a bit of a problem for him. It's a problem because his fate, as it were, is not in his own hands. It looked like in chapter 3 that he was the sort of master of his destiny in that sense, that if he wanted to marry Ruth, he could. But it seems like actually that's not the case. He's fallen for her, but there is somebody else who's in the picture. And although he wants to marry her, he can't. Now, at this point, it's probably worth saying 3 verse 10... the implication in 3 verse 10, when Boaz says to Ruth, you have not run after the younger men, whether rich or poor. The implication there is probably that Boaz is a bit older than Ruth. And whilst he may be a silver fox, nevertheless, his fate is not in his hands, because even though Ruth seems to have fallen for him, there's another man. And like as we saw last time, all good romantic tales do often have a twist in them, something to be overcome. And Boaz certainly does have this problem. He is legally number 2 in the pecking order. So whilst Boaz has a problem, he also has a bit of good fortune. Verse 1. Meanwhile, Boaz went up to the town gate and sat down there just as the guardian redeemer he had mentioned came along. Well, that's a bit of good fortune, isn't it? Except, of course, we know, if we've been looking at Ruth, that it is not a bit of good fortune. It was God's providence. It was not a coincidence that the guardian redeemer that he hoped to see was just walking along. No, this was God providentially bringing it to pass. In the same way that when Ruth and Naomi came back to Bethlehem, and it just happened to be the time of the barley harvest when Boaz was out in his field, that wasn't a coincidence. It was God bringing it together. And so Boaz now, in verse 1, has the opportunity, a providential opportunity, to sort things out and to potentially marry Ruth. But again, of course, there is a problem. There's a nearer relative, this guardian redeemer who is in charge, who has legal right. Now, just to recap a bit of this legal situation, it's a bit complicated, isn't it? It's very different to sort of our world and our situation. The Old Testament legislated for when a widow would die and be left childless, the brother of the person that she'd married was meant to provide a child for her. so that the child that would be born would have the other brother, the dead brother's name, and the sort of land, the inheritance could pass on. And if there wasn't a brother to do that, in this case, Marlon has died, and also his brother Killian has died, then the nearest male relative was to do that, to act on behalf of that situation. Now, Boaz is one of those relatives. He's one of those people, but he's not the nearest in line. There's somebody else living in Bethlehem. And so Boaz is there that morning, wants to sort this out, and the man comes along, and at the town gate with the elders there, he explains the situation. Verse 2. He tells them to sit down. Then he said to the guardian redeemer, Naomi, who has come back from Moab, is selling the piece of land that belonged to our relative Elimelech. I thought I should bring the matter to your attention and suggest that you buy it in the presence of these seated here and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, do so. But if you will not, tell me, so I know. For no one has the right to do it except you, and I am next in line. Now, you'd be forgiven for being slightly confused at this point, because this land that belongs to Elimelech, I think this is the first time we sort of understand that there's a bit of land involved. It seems that there's a bit of land in Bethlehem that belonged to Elimelech, who's died, and it also therefore belonged to his two sons as inheritance, but they also have died, and therefore Naomi wants to sell it. She wants to sell it on to the nearest relative to keep it in the family. For them back then, the physical land that they were living in was really, really important. And that's still true of many parts of the world. It's probably slightly alien to us as a culture. So help me out here. I'm asking for a bit of participation here. Put your hands up if you live in the same city, same town now that you were born in. Were you born in Swindon? Swindon area? So fair few. Very good. Put your hands up if you live in the same area of Swindon that you were born in. Okay, there's a few. Yeah, very good. Not many, though, but a few. Very good. How's it if you living in the same road that you were either born in or sort of came back because you were... Well, there's a few. But not many. But a few. Most British people, I found out this week, live more than 100 miles from where they were born. We move around a lot. Most people don't live in the place that they were born. But of course, back then, it was different. Not least because they didn't have transport stuff, and working remotely from the office, from home, wasn't really a thing. But it was theological reasons. The reason was that land that they were living in, the land of Canaan, was given to them by covenant. God had promised the land to Abraham and Abraham's descendants, and therefore the physical land that they were living in was really important. That land got divided up by tribes and clans and family units and so on. And whilst we may find it sort of strange to get our heads around that, nevertheless, the land that they were living in was so important. And that's why Naomi wants the land to be sold, not just on the open market, to sort of whoever will give her the highest price, but to a family member. It was given to a particular family, a particular tribe, particular clan, particular family. And that's why it needs to be sold to the nearest relative. It's perhaps quite a different way of thinking to us. But this nearest relative comes, who we don't know his name. He's a bit of a bit part player in this story. But he comes along, and at first, he's interested, isn't he? It says, verse 4, he says, I will redeem it. Now, this is, of course, a bit of a problem for Boaz, because he doesn't want that answer. But he has a bit of a plan. He sells him the vision of it, and then he gives him the terms and conditions. Verse 5. The fine print, on the day that you buy the land, you also acquire Ruth, the Moabite, the dead man's widow, in order to maintain the name of the dead man with his property. Well, he hadn't checked the terms and conditions before he agreed. Verse 6, this, he says, then I cannot redeem it, because I might endanger my own estate. You redeem it yourself. I cannot do it. The man refuses. Now, this is not an insult to Ruth. It's not that he doesn't, fancy her or doesn't want to marry her in any way. He makes it quite clear, verse 6, he can't do that because he'll endanger his own estate. I think the implication here is, if it was buying a piece of land, that would be financially beneficial to him. He'd get a bit of land. But because it's not just that, it's providing for the dead man's wife in order to produce an heir, not for himself, but for another part of the family, for Ruth, for Mahlon. Therefore, it's going to cost him. It's not just that he gains something by buying a bit of land, he's actually then got to provide for another family. And that land that he's going to buy actually won't belong to him, it'll belong to another part of the family. And therefore, he says, verse 6, he can't do it. Presumably, financially, he can't do it. And that, I think, takes us really to the heart of the issue. The issue is not so much about the land or the sale, it's about providing for the needy. It's about providing for those who don't have anything, raising up an heir for the dead man. So the problem is no longer a problem, is it? Because the man is out of it. He's ruled himself out. But Boaz is willing to be a guardian redeemer. And we've seen that in chapter 2. We've seen that in chapter 3. He's a godly man. He's a generous man. Presumably he's a man of means. He owns fields. And so they exchange contracts. This little bit in verse 7 and 8 where they, instead of exchanging contracts with the solicitor, they exchange sandals, which seems to be what they did then. And he does the deal. He signs it. He makes the deal happen. Now, if you have ever bought a house, perhaps it was a long time ago now, sometimes you can get, particularly if you're a first-time buyer, some estate agents sort of give you a sort of box of stuff. I think we had a box of chocolates and flyers for various insurance things that we needed. And I think some people get champagne if you've got a really good estate agent. Maybe not. Boaz, when he makes this purchase, what does he get? Verse 11. He gets a blessing. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your home like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the family of Israel. May you have standing. And then it says, verse 12, through the offspring the Lord gives you by this young woman, may your family be like that of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah. Now we'll get to what that's all about. But we have a blessing. He marries Ruth. No longer is there a problem, but he gets a blessing. And that takes us to the second part of the story, a provision for Naomi. Now the blessing that Boaz is given is that Boaz and Ruth are to be fruitful, are to be as fruitful as Rachel and Leah. Now Rachel and Leah back in Genesis, together with their servants, provided the 12 tribes of Israel. Now you think about it, that's very fruitful, isn't it? They had lots of children, and those children formed the bedrock, the foundation of the whole nation of Israel. And the blessing on Ruth and Boaz is, we want you to be as fruitful as them, to be a blessing like them, and also to be like Perez and Tamar. We'll get to them. And so they get married. You can see that verse 13. Boaz took Ruth. She became his wife. When he made love to her, the Lord enabled her to conceive, and she gave birth to a son. Now, if the story ended at that point, you think that's a lovely story, because all the way through we've sort of seen this being hinted at in chapter 2, in chapter 3. They get married, and they have a family. It's a sort of happily ever after part of the story that we'd love. It would be great if it finished like that. It would be a suitable climax to the book if the book ended in that way, but it doesn't end like that. They have a child, and there's another blessing. Verse 14, the women said to Naomi, praise be to the Lord, who this day has not left you without a guardian redeemer. May he become famous throughout Israel. He will renew your life and sustain you in your old age. For your daughter-in-law, who loves you and is better to you than 7 sons, has given him birth. Then Naomi took the child in her arms and cared for him. The women living there said, Naomi has a son. And they named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. Now, this is a bit strange, isn't it, when you think about it? Because all the fuss here, when the baby's been born, is on the mother-in-law, is on Naomi, not on Ruth. In fact, Ruth, in these bits, gets sidelined. Verse 13, she gets married to Boaz. They live happily ever after. They have a child, and she's not really sort of mentioned. All the focus is on the mother-in-law. And my mother-in-law does occasionally watch these sermons, so I won't make a joke at this point. But and actually, it's not even the mother-in-law. It's the sort of ex-mother-in-law. Because, of course, her daughter-in-law has married somebody else now. But why is she at the center of all of this? The book is called Ruth. Ruth has got married to Boaz. Ruth has had a child, and Naomi seems to be at the center of attention. What's going on? Well, I think in some ways this brings us to really what the heart of what was going on. Boaz married Ruth. He was a generous man. He wanted to provide for the family, and the baby born was to provide an heir. And really it was to propagate the dead man's name. Naomi's son, of course, Mahlon, who we find out was Mahlon here. In other words, the focus isn't so much on the fact that Ruth has had a child, but that Naomi's son, who's dead, has in some sense had a child through Boaz. Does that make sense? The focus is on Naomi and Elimelech and their line, less on Boaz and Ruth. The point was that there was to be a child raised from Elimelech, from Mahlon's line, which Boaz has provided. And therefore it is right that the focus is on Naomi as Elimelech's wife and widow. And somehow it's sort of seen that the baby is sort of like hers. You can see that verse 17. Naomi has a son. They called him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. Apropos of nothing, really, when we did this story with our children, they laughed hysterically at the name Obed. It is a great name, Obed. Now, Obed is in the list of people from whom Jesus is descended. You can read about that in Matthew chapter 1, if you like. But, of course, Obed's mother was not Naomi, was Ruth. Jesus is descended biologically from Ruth, from Boaz, Ruth, Obed, not from Naomi. But nevertheless, the blessing was for Naomi here. And just look at what they say in verse 15. Your daughter-in-law, who loves you, is better to you than 7 sons. That's an extraordinary thing to say, particularly in the context of the ancient Near East, which valued sons. We've seen this in the book, the value of having a male heir. And yet it says that Ruth is better even than 7 sons. What a thing to say. What a compliment to Ruth and to her character. And what a blessing that Naomi has received. Because in many ways, although the book is called Ruth, although the focus of the story is Boaz and Ruth, really actually Naomi has been a central figure. Because the book opened with a story of Naomi experiencing death. The death of her husband, the death of her 2 children, and it ends with life. A little baby sat on her lap in chapter 4. We've had 3 funerals, now we have a wedding and a baby. And it's moved from emptiness to fullness. Just look at chapter 1. Flick back to chapter 1 with me. Chapter 121. Naomi says, I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. The thing that she says in the first chapter is, I am empty. And in fact, in chapter 3:17, Boaz says to Ruth, talking of Naomi, he says, don't go back to your mother-in-law empty-handed. It's interesting. The idea that in the beginning of the book she's empty, by the end of the book she's full. She'd experienced death and bitterness, now she has life through the kinsman redeemer Boaz. And in many ways, that is in some sense a picture of the gospel, isn't it? A picture of the lavish grace of God, who is in the business of transforming lives, of reversing fortunes. God sent the kinsman redeemer, Jesus, the guardian redeemer, one of us, our brother, clothed in human flesh, to redeem us, to buy us back, to transform our lives, to reverse our fortunes, as it were. He emptied himself so that we could receive fullness. He gave his life so that we could receive life. And it means that this evening, if we are Christians, we've experienced something of the reality of this. Something of the reality of God changing situations. And it may be that the situation that you're in right now feels pretty hopeless. That you feel pretty empty. The bitterness. Perhaps you're in the sort of chapter 1 stage of Naomi's life. Feeling bitterness. Feeling like in some sense the hand of the Lord is against you. Maybe it's a job or health or finances or worries, whatever's going on. Perhaps you feel low spiritually. But God is well able to take you out of that situation. He is well able to reverse your fortunes, as it were, to transform things. Maybe in this life, but certainly in the next. He is in the business of transforming lives, and Ruth shows us that. From death and emptiness to life and fullness. God had not given up on his people. He had not given up on Naomi. Now just think for a second what it must have been like for her back in chapter 1, to be in a famine, to leave her home, to be in Moab, a different country where she didn't know the language, where her husband dies, her 2 children have died. Imagine what that must have been like. And then by chapter 4, she's got a little baby boy sat on her lap. It's amazing, isn't it? Imagine what she'd have been feeling then with a little boy cuddling him. That's what God had done for her. It's an amazing story. It's a beautiful example of what God can do. Now, it happened through the generosity of Boaz. But of course, Boaz shows us what Jesus is like. The single-minded devotion to his bride, providing for her, blessing her. It is just a faint echo of what Jesus is like, who gives himself for us. Jesus is in the business of transforming fortunes. He has given himself on the cross so that we can receive all of his riches, all of his generosity. And that leads us to the final point, a plan for the nations. A plan for the nations. Now, there's a saying, isn't there, that sort of familiarity breeds contempt. And I think sometimes the more familiar we are with bits of the Bible, the harder it is to sort of see things in a fresh way. Perhaps we skip over details. I think that's particularly the case in stories that we are really familiar with. Flick back in your Bible to Ruth 1. Ruth 1, verse 4. Talking of Naomi's children, it says, they married Moabite women, one named Orpah and the other Ruth. 1 verse 22 says, Naomi returned from Moab, accompanied by Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law. It mentions that Ruth is a Moabite, someone from Moab, a lot in the book of Ruth. It mentions it in addition to those that I've just read, 2 verse 2, 2 verse 6, 2:21, 4 verse 5, 4 verse 10. In addition to those references, there are lots of references to Moab as a place. It's a repeated theme. Why is it a repeated theme? She's not an Israelite. Now, we know that. We've heard it mentioned in every sermon in this sermon series. But it's really important. She is a stranger to the covenants. She's not part of the Abrahamic covenant. She's not one of Abraham's descendants. She'd have had a funny accent. She was a foreigner, a stranger. She worshipped idols, we saw reference back in chapter 1. But no longer. She's now part of the family. She's been brought in. A foreigner has been brought in, welcomed as one of God's people. That is unusual in the Old Testament. It's not unique to this story, but it is certainly unusual. Interestingly, Boaz's mum, Rahab, was a Canaanite and brought into the family. But she is an outsider. But it reminds us, even in the Old Testament, the plan was to bless the nation of Israel. Why? So that the nations could be blessed. So that the nations could be brought in to be God's people. And Ruth here is a picture of that. It'll be much clearer in the New Testament, but Ruth is a little example of that. And that undeserved grace of God, that undeserved kindness and his providence in bringing that about, makes sense of this slightly odd reference in verse 12, where they say, "May your family, Ruth and Boaz, be like that of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah." Now, you'd be forgiven for not really knowing who Perez is. He's a very minor character, born in Genesis 38, born from Judah and Tamar. Now, it's likely that lots of the descendants in the Bethlehem area were descendants of Perez, of Judah. They sort of lived in Bethlehem. But also Tamar's situation back in Genesis was a little bit similar to Ruth's. Tamar's husband died. She needed somebody to raise up a male child for her. Nobody would. And in the end, she disguised herself as a prostitute and slept with her father-in-law. Her father-in-law thinking that she was a prostitute, her father-in-law being Judah. Now, I don't say this flippantly, but that is a messed up family situation when that happens. It was a terrible mess, a terrible sin, and Perez came from that. But isn't it interesting? That family situation that was messed up, that was broken, that was sinful. Verse 18, this is the family line of Perez. Where does the family line end up? With David. With King David, ultimately with King Jesus. That's why the book finishes with a family line. The book could have finished at verse 13. It's before verse 13. Just after verse 13 would have been lovely. It could have finished after verse 17. That would have been a nice ending. But it ends with this family line. With the family line linking not just anybody, not just sort of Abraham to David, but Perez to David. Perez is a slightly strange character. But Perez was born from a terrible situation, a mess, a sinful situation, but God used even that sin, to bring about a line where King David would be born, where he would make a covenant with David to bless the world, ultimately to bring his son Jesus into the world. It reminds us, no family situation is too messy. There is no family problem beyond God's redemption. Even the situation between Judah and Tamar with Perez. God was using that family line, of all the family lines in Israel, using that one to bring about King David. And of course, the reference to King David at the end reminds us that King David had a greater son, King Jesus, who died for the sins of the nations, who was the true guardian redeemer, the true one who came to buy us back, even from a family of Tamar and of Ruth and Rahab. That's the family line of King Jesus. That is God's plan for the nations, to give grace even to those who are least deserving of it.